Good morning. It is Wednesday, January the 30th, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America today, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo, speaking to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers. You and I have been brainwashed into believing we are conservative when in reality we are reactionary. Decades ago, the Democrats, with the acquiescence of Republicans, set the table, politically speaking, by deliberately redefining political identity. The Democrats decided that one's positions on the issues are what define the political parties. Naturally, the Democrats decided what the issues should be. The news departments reinforced this decision, and the Republicans paid the consequences. The Democrats created an action-reaction political dynamic, with Republicans playing the role of reactionary. In reality, voters are either left or right as a matter of fact, not a matter of opinion. The most essential political fact of reality is change. You and I are defined by our attitudes about change. Change is indicated when there is an improvement to the status quo. Unless there's something obviously better than what we have now, we stay the course. That's realistic, i.e. conservative. Constant change and the blind search for perfection is idealistic, i.e. liberal or socialist. Defining voters by the issues turns everything on its head. Progress and moving forward take precedence over common sense. Change, not because it's better, but for the sake of change. Act first, think later. Trial and error. Or I should say, trial and error. As a result of issues-based politics, Republicans become reflexively rigid and resist change for the sake of resisting change. We become caught in a trap of constantly reacting to liberals or socialists and unable to promote values. Talk show hosts have fallen into the reactionary trap of promoting opinion instead of values. The right talks and thinks only about political tactics and techniques, while American culture is ignored. This gets things backwards. If we concentrate on shaping our culture, the politics will follow. The political landscape today is the result of years and even decades of cultural influence, mainly by the left. Being conservative starts by asking questions, challenging the left's assumptions, and saying no. What's wrong with the way things are? Why question everything? Who says to question authority? What's wrong with being patriotic? What's wrong with being Christian? No, I'm not going to be promiscuous. No, I'm not going to give up my privacy. No, I'm not going to give up my property. No, I'm not going to deny reality, certainty, morality, and beauty. Being conservative isn't about standing athwart history and yelling, stop. It's about standing athwart history and yelling, prove it. Not fearing change, but not worshiping it either. Respecting the status quo, thinking first rather than acting first, subordinating might to right. And that is a kind of a summation of what this podcast is really all about. So this morning I happened to listen to earlier a little clip from Liz Wheeler, who slams a feminist that's saying that there is no equality. And so she has a little clip or show or cut from something called The Final Point. And I get it off of YouTube, but here it is. Just a second.
Welcome back. One final point before we go tonight. A feminist by the name of Joanna Schroeder told me today on Twitter that you can't be for the equality of women and vote for Trump. She said you can't. Well, she's wrong, and here's why. She was talking about Gina Haspel's confirmation hearing because liberal feminists turned out en masse to oppose Gina Haspel, even though Gina Haspel will be the first woman ever to be the chief of the CIA. Now, the reason this is significant is not because we should judge nominees based on their gender instead of their qualifications. We shouldn't, but liberals do that. Liberals told us that we should vote for Hillary Clinton not because of her qualifications, but because she's a woman. So you can't have it both ways. Liberal feminists are hypocrites, and I just like to point that out. To any young woman who is listening to this, liberal feminists aren't championing you as a woman. They're using you as a woman as a pawn to further their political agenda. It's both disrespectful and it's insulting to our minds to suggest that we women vote with our lady parts instead of our brains. Now, out of the other side of their mouths, liberals are constantly harping on the idea. They say we need an equal number of women as men in Congress. We need to elevate women, they say, to high-powered positions in big companies and in government. Well, ladies, let me tell you what Donald Trump has done as president. President Trump, your president, appointed Nikki Haley as ambassador to the United Nations, Elaine Chao as Secretary of Transportation, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, Sarah Huckabee Sanders as Press Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen as Secretary of Homeland Security, Kellyanne Conway as Senior Advisor, also the first woman to run a winning presidential campaign, Linda McMahon as head of the Small Business Administration, Ivanka Trump as Senior Advisor, and Gina Haspel nominated for first woman CIA chief ever. How's that for elevating women? How's that for equality for women under Trump? So what was the reaction from liberals, you might be asking, since they always tell us to vote for liberal women because they're women? Well, liberals said Nikki Haley slept her way to the top. Ivanka Trump is like a diaper pail, shiny on the outside, full of crap on the inside. Kellyanne Conway's face looks like roadkill. Sarah Huckabee Sanders looks like she should coach a softball team. Elaine Chao only got that job because her husband is Mitch McConnell. And Gina Haspel, feminist Jessica Valenti, scoffed at Haspel's nomination to the CIA by saying, anyone who thinks Gina Haspel is a win for women's empowerment doesn't understand that there's a huge difference between being a feminist and being a woman who benefited from feminism. In other words, these liberals who told us to vote for Hillary because Hillary was a woman and demean conservative women as anti-equality because we're conservative and claim they want to elevate women to high-powered positions, attack the women elevated to high-powered positions in the Trump administration as if these women didn't work hard to achieve what they achieved on their own, as if their success is entirely due to men, their sexuality, or privilege. If that isn't the most anti-feminist thing I've ever heard. And that is my final point. You can reach me on Twitter at Liz_Wheeler. If you liked the show, please send me an email at oann.com/contact. In the meantime, catch us here tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern. And until then, have a good night.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to note about that, about her monologue there, was that it is, again, typically reactionary, just like it is with most pundits. Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, all of them. The first thing it seems that they do is they get up in the morning and scour the newspaper and find out what it is that the left is doing. What are the liberals doing? What is it that the socialists are saying? And then I'm going to go ahead and react to that. And the problem with that, again, is that no values are being promoted while that is happening, first of all. Second thing is that very often you're put in a position of trying to prove a negative, and which is absolutely impossible, and it's not our job. And just trying to prove things in general. Look at Liz Wheeler was saying, well, as though it was some kind of evidence or proof that he was an equality president, how the number of women that he went ahead and appointed. The problem is no real allegation of discrimination had been made. The individual that sent her the email simply stated you can't be a feminist and be a Trump supporter at the same time. She didn't say why that's impossible, why that's a dichotomy or a contradiction, being a supporter of Trump and a feminist at the same time. And since that means that the statement is arbitrary, which means that if you try to argue with that statement, you end up making yourself look bad. Going out and saying, well, Trump is, he's not a bad guy about feminism because he promoted 8 women to positions of power, is akin to saying, oh no, I'm not a racist because some of my friends are black. It just sounds like you are a racist who's trying to get away with something. That Donald Trump is a misogynist and that you support a misogynist and support misogyny, but you're just trying to get away with it. So you got to listen and read. And when you get an email that makes an accusation, but there's no support for it whatsoever, then you go ahead and ignore it. The only response that she should have provided for this individual sending the email is, your claim is arbitrary and therefore I get to ignore it, and then go on to something else. So you make yourself look bad, you make your followers look bad, especially if you're claiming to be a conservative, and you're going to be end up speaking on behalf of conservatives. And Ayn Rand was right when she says, if you can't get it right, keep your mouth shut. If you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. Because all you do is end up making yourself look bad and make your followers look bad. Every time that Rush Limbaugh goes ahead and deals with arbitrary things, which he does every day, arbitrary statements and whatnot, again, he makes himself look foolish, and by extension, he makes all of his followers look equally foolish. So hopefully that Liz Wheeler et al. Will figure it out someday, and they will quit wasting their time on arbitrary statements and start promoting values. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from Ayn Rand's lexicon. And thank you very much. Today's the concept of the day is aesthetic judgment. Now, a word of warning about the criteria of aesthetic judgment. A sense of life is the source of art, but it is not the sole qualification of an artist or of an aesthetician. It is not a criterion of aesthetic judgment. Emotions are not tools of cognition. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy, and just as a philosopher does not approach any other branch of his science with his feelings or emotions as his criterion of judgment, so he cannot do it in the field of aesthetics. A sense of life is not sufficient professional equipment. An aesthetician, as well as any man who attempts to evaluate artworks, must be guided by more than emotion. The fact that one agrees or disagrees with an artist's philosophy is irrelevant to the aesthetic appraisal of his work qua art. One does not have to agree with an artist, nor even to enjoy him, in order to evaluate his work. In essence, an objective evaluation requires that one identify the artist's theme, the abstract meaning of his work, exclusively by identifying the evidence contained in the work and allowing no other outside considerations, then evaluate the means by which he conveys it, i.e., taking his theme as criterion, evaluate the purely aesthetic elements of his work, the technical mastery, or lack of it, with which he projects or fails to project his view of life. Since art is a philosophical composite, it is not a contradiction to say, quote, this is a great work of art, but I don't like it, unquote. Provided one defines the exact meaning of that statement. The first part refers to a purely aesthetic appraisal, the second to a deeper philosophical level, which includes more than aesthetic values. And that was the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon. And when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the 10 books that screwed up the world and 5 that didn't help. And thank you. Welcome back. John Stuart Mill wrote a book called Utilitarianism in 1863, and this is one of the 10 books that screwed up the world. And because he was basically making the argument that the idea is to have the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, and that's the ethical thing to do. With quoting the book, let's begin with Mill's own statement of, quote, the greatest happiness principle, unquote, which underlies utilitarian moral philosophy and in admirably succinct form exposes its foolishness. Quote, according to the greatest happiness principle, the ultimate end with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, whether we are considering our own good or that of other people, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality. The test of quality and the rule for measuring it against quantity being the preference felt by those who, in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with the means of comparison. This being, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end of human action. It is necessarily also the standard of morality, which may accordingly be defined, the rules and precepts for the human conduct, by the observance of which an existence such as has been described might be, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but, so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole of sentient creation." Unquote. If we unlace Mill's dry, tangled prose, we find that he is saying exactly what Epicurus said. Morality's foundation is not God, but pleasure and pain. But Mill adds to Epicurus two entirely necessary and entirely contradictory things. The first thing Mill adds is the test of quality. A moment's reflection reveals why this is necessary. The obvious rejoinder to Epicureanism, one made frequently against both Epicurus and Mill, is that it is a philosophy for pigs. Pigs also feel pleasure and pain. They like tasty grub, wallow in the mud on a hot day, a fence to scratch where it itches, and a little porcine romance when the mood strikes. If happiness is simply equated with pleasure, then the greatest happiness principle yields the conclusion that the perfect society would resemble that of well-fed hogs, grunting about contentedly in a sty, or if we wish to maximize the intensity of pleasure to yield even greater happiness, the raging bacchanalia of an endless college fraternity party. Not a very elevated view of human morality, but entirely appropriate to the notion that morality should be rooted in pleasure and pain. To counter this very obvious rejoinder, Mill insists that we must also take into account the pleasure of fine wine, classical music, the reading of philosophy by a fire, helping the downtrodden, disentangling Greek syntax to get a purer translation of Plato, and, of course, the peculiar tingling sensation one gets from being a, quote, reformer of the world, unquote. But even here, another obvious rejoinder appears. If, as Bentham asserted, we must weigh pleasure against pleasure to calculate the greatest happiness for the greatest number, it would seem by sheer numbers that the pigs will win out. Pile up on one side of the scales the men who would rather guzzle cheap beer, have entirely unconstrained sex, and watch football for days at a time. On the other, put the number who would rather parse a sentence in Greek and then go out and save hapless widows from penury. It doesn't take much practice in prophecy to see which way the scales will tip. Thus, according to the greatest happiness principle, society should be set up legally and morally to maximize the pleasures of pigs, since their happiness/pleasure so drastically outweighs the pleasures of someone like Mill. To avoid this, Mill claims that quality must judge quantity. That is, what constitutes happiness must be judged by those who, quote, in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with the means of comparison, unquote. As we shall see, this is actually a long-winded way of saying, quote, I, John Stuart Mill, and people just like me will judge and rank the pleasures, and hence determine how society will serve the greatest happiness principle, unquote. But now another problem arises. On the face of it, Mill would seem to be suggesting that the judge of morality must, as each pleasure, no matter how degraded, comes along, leap in with both feet to test the waters. Mill's atheism forces him to assert this ridiculous and unnatural position. Since there is no creator God, and hence absolutely no moral commands written into nature, there are no intrinsically wrong actions. Consequently, the only way of judging things morally is by the actual experience of pleasure and pain. Our moral judge will have to experience both the staid and subtle pleasures of marital fidelity and the wild pleasures of adultery, of sobriety and drunkenness, of playing chess and jello wrestling, of reading papal encyclicals and pulp fiction, of fastidious vegetarianism and indiscriminate cannibalism. The hilarious thing is that Mill himself has said as much. On a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or, if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. And there needs to be the less hesitation to accept this judgment respecting the quality of pleasures, since there is no other tribunal to be referred to even on the question of quantity, which means are there of determining which means are there of determining which is the acuter of two pains, or the intenser of two pleasurable sensations, except the general suffrage of those who are familiar with both? What is there to decide whether a particular pleasure is worth pursuing at the cost of a particular pain, except the feelings and judgment of the experienced?" Unquote. And so with Mill here, a lot of this is basically very much materialistic, which is something that you see in society today from the left. The left constantly argues the idea that it doesn't matter morality and things of that nature that are conceptual and abstract don't matter when you're hungry, when you don't have a job, when you can't pay the rent. Okay. But there's a lot more to life than simply pleasure and pain. That there is, again, there's justice, if nothing else. And justice is not something you can touch or feel. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the 10 books every conservative ought to read. Thank you very much. And he's on about G.K. Chesterton here, a book that he wrote. And this section of the chapter is called The Cosmic Patriot. "If I were by some strange circumstance compelled to offer a definitive proof of the existence of God, and do so in the least number of words, I would simply reply, Chesterton. That so strange and marvelous a creature as G.K. Chesterton could exist makes it quite impossible, indeed unconscionable, to be an atheist. Nothing but a divine cause could explain such a superabundance of intellect continually overflowing into laughter. A cosmic patriot might seem a contradiction. Patriotism is love for a particular place, and Chesterton did indeed love his particular place of England. But Chesterton also loved the world, indeed the cosmos, as if it were a small and endearing shrine. If he had been alive during the time of Thomas Aquinas, he would have been credited with, quote, a love for the glory of God's creation, unquote. For that is what his cosmic patriotism meant. He defended this world against those who despised it so much that they wanted to change it into something else, a utopia of their own design. That spirit of defense defines his orthodoxy. It is also what makes Chesterton a conservative in the most fundamental sense. For those who have not read Chesterton, be forewarned. Chesterton was one of the very few human beings who actually had a, quote, rapier wit, unquote, a mind so sharp and nimble, and footwork so quick and light, that we are left astonished at the effortless rapidity and exactitude of his strokes. Each turns out to be a stroke of genius. Chesterton can say in a short paragraph what it takes others with much more labor to say in entire books. Reading Chesterton is much like reading Shakespeare, except that Chesterton speaks in our own idiom, and for Chesterton there are only comedies. And the book that he's basically reviewing here now, Benjamin Wiker, is by Chesterton, is called Orthodoxy, just in case you want to maybe Google it or go on to Amazon and take a peek and see what it is he's talking about. I myself, I've heard of G.K. Chesterton, but I didn't know he was that big of a deal. So he is somebody that I think I want to go ahead and take a look at in terms of reading. Other books that I think are excellent that would be along the fiction lines, Ayn Rand had made two recommendations. One was called 93, and it's by Victor Hugo. And it was an outstanding book, absolutely outstanding. And she hit it right on the head with that one. And another one that was also equally outstanding is a book called Quo Vadis by Sienkiewicz. And so then there's this one also by Gilbert Keith Chesterton. So I will go ahead and take a look at that book and see what I think about it. And you might want to do the same thing. But at this point, that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening and have a great day.